Dorothy always woke up at the same time in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, as scheduled. Even if the night was restless, if she had to stay in bed until midnight, her eyes would still open by themselves at 6:30, as if someone invisible was ringing an alarm clock inside her head. James was sleeping next to her, loudly, with some special sound that she had learned to ignore over 30 years of marriage. Her brain just stopped noticing that snoring solo in the silence of the night. Her signature tea had already been prepared in the kitchen. In advance, it was always brewed in the evening, so that in the morning just pour it into a mug and warm it up. It was such a small ritual, part of the very routine that could drive you crazy if you thought about it too long. She was standing at the stove stirring tea with a spoon and looking out the window. There was a small garden behind the glass, in which James had long promised to install a new bench. But the bench, of course, remained a promise. James walked slowly over to the kitchen table, scratching his head possessively.
You're up early again.
As always. In the morning, silence, you can only hear the kettle hissing. Otherwise, with your snoring, you won't get much rest at night.
Snoring, so I'm still bothering you. Are you really complaining about your old husband?
Where is it going? I'm used to it, like tinnitus, I just think sometimes what a life this is. It's the same thing every day. Everything seems to be fine, but there is not enough fresh air.
Dorothy put a cup of his coffee in front of James, bitter, black, as he liked it. James looked at her in mild surprise.
What are you talking about, honey? What are you missing? We're here together. There is a house, a job, children and their families. Isn't that enough?
I don't know. Maybe not enough. Or a lot. I don't understand with a slight smile, like in.
You're always with these thoughts. You remember old songs. I thought you'd calmed down a long time ago.
Maybe she calmed down. But something's eating at you, James. I don't really know how to explain it to you.
She waved her hand as if trying to dismiss her own thoughts. These conversations began to be repeated more and more often. It was as if they both stepped on the same corn over and over again every day, but no one knew how to heal it. James got up and looked around their kitchen, so familiar, with a slightly scratched table that they had bought when the children were little. All these details which had once pleased him now seemed, well, just things.
So what do you suggest? To rush somewhere? Go to the ocean, like we always said.
It's going somewhere again. Where are we going, James? I'm not thinking about traveling anymore. Tell me, how do I live so that I can return to myself?
Come back to yourself? What are you talking about? Do you really have anything to doubt? You're doing fine? Everyone loves you?
That's weird. Everyone loves me, everything is fine, but I don't recognize myself. Sometimes I remember what I used to be like. Funny, cheeky. And now I'm looking in the mirror, and who is it?
James scratched his chin thoughtfully. He knew that she sometimes went into these strange, incomprehensible thoughts. But what to do about it, how to react to it at all, he did not know.
You've always been too deep for me, Dorothy. I just want to live. It's simple. But you're always looking for something more.
And maybe that's the problem. I'm not looking anymore.
They finished their morning coffee in silence. It was their usual silence, the one that had accumulated over the years and years of marriage. There was no anger or resentment in that silence. It was just that. After breakfast, James was going to his job, and then everything was repeated, as if according to a script that they knew by heart. Her thoughts began to slip away from her in the morning hours. As if gnawed by a worm of melancholy, she began to see life in a different way, with this grey veil, as they say. When James walked out the door, Dorothy returned to the kitchen table, where his cup of half-finished coffee was still on it. For a second, she wanted to just throw that cup away, as if that action could change their lives. Later in the afternoon, when James returned from work, they had dinner together in almost complete silence. This silent room reminded Dorothy more and more of what she was missing. Maybe it would still be possible to return that spark, but how? After all she had were habits, routine, and James by her side.
Dorothy, have you ever thought that we could? Well, I don't know, change the situation? Maybe we should go visit our people.
And what's there? All the same conversations. I just want to. I want to find something of my own, James. Something that's only mine, you know?
Am I bothering you to be yourself?
No, it's not about you. It's like I've lost myself.
He put down his fork and sighed, trying not to get annoyed.
You've confused yourself. That's what I think. You're always digging into the past instead of enjoying what's there now.
Maybe so. But I remember the me I used to be. I was brave, passionate, and now I'm afraid to take my mind off the usual for even 5 minutes. It's like I'm living on a schedule, like a notebook.
James seemed a little embarrassed, as if he realized that there was truth in her words, but did not want to admit it.
Brave, then. Okay, maybe you really need a distraction. Take a day for yourself. Go somewhere, chat with old friends. Why are you sitting at home?
Thanks for the advice, James. But if it was just that, I would have done something long ago. It's more than just going out for coffee with someone.
Well, maybe you need to stop looking for something beyond. We live here together, we're living, and that's enough, Dorothy.
She smiled sadly at him. He didn't understand, but he couldn't understand either, because he didn't feel what was weighing on her. The following week, Dorothy went to the grocery store as usual. Picking up the cart and already habitually making her way between the shelves, she suddenly heard a familiar, slightly velvety voice somewhere behind her. The voice was so familiar and yet so far away that her heart stopped for a second. She turned slowly and saw him, Marcus, her first love.
Dorothy. God, how many years have passed? Is it really you?
Dorothy blinked several times as if she couldn't believe her eyes. Standing in front of her was a man she hadn't seen in decades, but whom she once seemed to know better than anyone. Marcus looked a little older. His hair was completely grey now, but there were still sparkles in his eyes, as when they met in their youth.
Marcus, is that really you? How many years have passed?
Marcus slowly approached her, staring intently, as if trying to make sure that it was really her.
It's been too long to count, right? I didn't even think I'd be able to meet you here, among the shelves of bread and milk.
I can't believe it. When did you get back? Or didn't you leave at all?
I have recently returned. I've been to a lot of places over the years, but now he returned to his native land. And you. You're still the same.
Dorothy chuckled, feeling her heart strangely ache. Something in his words caused her to have mixed feelings, bitterness, and an unexpected wave of memories.
I doubt it's the same. It's been so many years I'm not the same girl who laughed at your jokes anymore, Marcus.
Well, you're wrong, Dorothy. There's something about you. There's something about you. The smile, the look, the eyes are still shining.
She was embarrassed, as she used to be when he looked at her like that in his youth. Back then, she thought his gaze was the deepest and most understanding of all. And now that look was back in front of her, and suddenly her everyday life, her routine, all this faded in front of this real, living feeling.
I thought about you sometimes, you know, especially when it was lonely. I don't think you can imagine how many times I've regretted that it turned out that way back then.
The past is the past, Marcus. We haven't been who we were back then for a long time.
Maybe so, but I can't deny that meeting you here is. Let's just say it makes you think.
They both fell silent for a second, feeling the silence grow tense. Marcus finally cleared his throat and offered,
Why don't we go out for coffee? After all, so many years have passed. We can just talk. Like old friends, right?
Dorothy looked at him thoughtfully. A thought flashed through her mind about James, about the house, about what she was supposed to do tonight. But something inside was whispering, why not?
Good. I think I can spare an hour. After all, it's just a conversation.
They settled down in a small coffee shop not far from the store. Marcus ordered black coffee and Dorothy chose tea, as before. That made Marcus chuckle.
Tea, as always. You haven't changed, Dorothy.
Well, you know, habits are like a second self. You seem to be ordering the same coffee yourself.
Maybe we both haven't changed as much as we think.
But you know, life has changed after all. Marriage, children, work. These are no longer the days when we dreamed of distant lands and great things.
Are you still dreaming, Dorothy? Or has all this routine killed the girl in you that you once were?
His question caught her off guard. She turned away, looking out the window. What is she dreaming about? When was the last time she dreamed of something for real? Since she married James, her life has turned into a series of predictable steps without the vivacity that once was in her.
Sometimes. Maybe I didn't even forget to dream. It's just that my dreams have changed. Or I made myself believe it.
And what, Dorothy? Isn't it possible to dream now? Does age, marriage, or anything else prevent us from looking for ourselves?
She thought about his words. They seemed so simple, but maybe that was the whole point. She forgot that you can be yourself, not a wife, not a mother, not part of the family routine, but just yourself.
Tell me honestly, are you happy? No need to answer out of politeness, just honestly, are you happy?
Happy. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe not. I even stopped thinking about it.
Marcus reached out, gently touching her palm.
Dorothy, I know it's not that easy right now, but maybe this is a chance? A chance to at least remember who you were.
She took her hand away, but that touch left a mark in her heart. It was as if Marcus had stirred up all her fears, insecurities, and lost dreams.
Marcus, this is all so unexpected. I came to the store for bread, not to look for myself.
They both laughed, and it was a real laugh, light, like when they were young. She felt that she was alive again, that her heart was not locked in a routine.
I'm glad I could meet you. And you know what? I'm not leaving yet. If you just want to talk or have a coffee, you know where to find me.
Maybe. I'll think about it.
Marcus paid and helped her get up from the table. They said goodbye, and she felt a slight jolt in her heart again. As soon as he left, Dorothy felt like she was alone with her thoughts and feelings, with this new or long-forgotten freedom inside. It had been a few weeks since Dorothy and Marcus had met at the coffee shop, but thoughts of him haunted her. She often returned to memories of the past, and to the words he had said to her. These words seemed to take root in her mind, tearing her feelings in two. She knew that her life had long since found its usual, calm rhythm, but the strange excitement that meetings with Marcus brought did not let her go. In the evening, when James left to meet with friends, Dorothy decided to meet Marcus again. She called him, and his voice, as always, was full of warmth.
Marcus, I was thinking maybe we could go for a walk again? Just like that time in the park.
I've been waiting for your call, Dorothy. Of course, let's meet.
They met again in the park, which seemed to keep their secrets and memories. The evening air was cool, and when Marcus saw her, he took off his scarf and draped it over her shoulders.
You've always been so fragile but strong inside. How are you, Dorothy? Is everything okay?
I'm not sure. Every time we meet, I feel like I'm walking on thin ice. I'm scared, Marcus.
I know, but I'm here with you. I'm not going anywhere. You can trust me.
They walked slowly along the path strewn with fallen leaves, and her heart was beating faster with every step. Marcus walked beside her, barely touching her shoulder, but it was enough for her to feel something long forgotten awakening in her again.
Marcus, I keep thinking. How did it happen that we lost each other then? Why was everything so difficult?
Do you remember how we dreamed of leaving? We were young and naive. You were afraid to leave your family, and I thought the world was waiting for me. Except I was wrong. I didn't find anything worth you.
Dorothy stopped, her gaze filled with sadness and disappointment.
And here we are again, after all these years. It's like we're going back to the beginning, but now it's even more complicated. We have a past, we have obligations. I do not know how this is possible.
Marcus gently hugged her, and she felt his warmth warming her. This hug reminded her of her younger years when she felt truly loved.
Don't think about what's impossible. Let's just be here and now, without encumbrances.
They walked slowly along the park again, and the conversation seemed to become more and more frank, as if they could no longer contain their feelings.
Every time I'm with you, it's like I'm finding myself. But what happens then? How can I go back to my old life?
Maybe it's not worth going back to the old one. You deserve to be happy, even if it means breaking the usual order of things.
Her heart sank at those words. Dorothy knew he was right, but it was unbearably difficult to realize. A few days after this meeting, Dorothy found herself back with Marcus in the same park. It became their little secret hideout. They were sitting on the same bench, and Marcus took her hand, stroking her palm, as if hoping to convey his support to her.
Marcus, I think about it every time and I feel like I have to stop. It's all wrong. We are no longer young lovers. I have a family, a husband to whom I owe a debt.
How do you feel about me, Dorothy? You don't have to answer out of a sense of duty. You can be honest.
She froze, and the silence between them became filled with tension. For the first time in years, she wanted to really answer this question honestly.
I feel alive when I'm with you, Marcus. But it's weird. I still feel like I'm betraying James even just by dating you.
You don't betray anyone unless you betray yourself. You have a right to be happy, Dorothy. I'm not asking you to choose me, but I'm asking you to choose yourself.
These words seemed to break through the barriers that she had been building all her life. Dorothy suddenly realized that Marcus was the only person who really saw her for real, without all those masks and roles that she wore in the family. With each new meeting, they revealed their souls to each other more and more. Conversations, touches, glances, all this began to remind her of who she once was and what she had lost over the years of marriage and caring for her family. One evening, when they were sitting on the bench again, Marcus looked at her especially deeply.
Have you ever thought that we could be together? Not now, maybe, but in the future.
I'm afraid to think about it. If I imagine this, how will I be able to return home? How can I look James in the eye?
I know it's not easy, but I want you to know that no matter what you decide, I will always be here. I won't push, I won't rush. Just know that I am.
Those words sent a wave of warmth and fear through her at the same time. She knew that he was saying this from the heart, and she felt that she couldn't just cut it short, even if she wanted to.
Marcus, I'm not sure I deserve this. You give me too much, and I'm afraid I won't be able to return the favor.
You respond by opening up to me, Dorothy. You're showing me the self I knew and loved. That's all I'm asking.
With each meeting, two forces fought in Dorothy's heart. One wanted to return to her usual life, to James, to her family, but the other, the one that had awakened in her thanks to Marcus, longed for freedom, longed to live for herself, as she had not allowed herself for a long time. That night, after returning home from another meeting, Dorothy sat in her bedroom and thought about what had happened. Her heart was torn between duty and the feeling she could no longer suppress. James was used to the fact that his life with Dorothy was measured and calm. Over the years of their marriage, he had learned to appreciate the routine in which they lived and believed that they had achieved a kind of quiet happiness, hidden from the outside world. It was almost inconceivable to him that life could somehow shake this well-established foundation. Each of their days was similar to the previous one, but he did not see anything wrong with it. On the contrary, he considered it a guarantee of stability and family happiness. However, lately he had begun to notice something strange about Dorothy's behavior. At first, it was the little things. Her gaze became distant, and sometimes she went into her own thoughts, even when they spent time together. She began to stay out of the house more and more often, take long walks, and returned with such a strange, seemingly enlightened expression on her face. James tried to ignore it, writing it off as an accident, or perhaps an aggravation of her melancholy. He knew that Dorothy often thought about life, and he was used to not interfering with her at such moments. But as time went on, it began to worry him. One evening, when Dorothy returned late, he noticed traces on her coat, something like autumn leaves stuck to the fabric, as if she had been sitting somewhere on the street or in the park for a long time. James noticed it immediately, but didn't show it. He just quietly watched as she carefully took off her coat and hung it in the closet without saying a word. Her hands were shaking, and he suddenly felt an anxiety rising in his heart, which he could not get rid of. At that moment, James realized that his familiar world was about to change. In the days that followed, he tried to keep an eye on her unnoticed, looking for the slightest signs of change. It would seem that he knew her by heart, knew her every habit, every gesture, but now it began to seem to him that he was living next to someone completely different. He noticed that Dorothy began to pay more attention to her appearance, although she had never really thought about how she looked before. Now her morning began with standing in front of the mirror for a long time, carefully choosing clothes and applying light makeup. James sensed that she was trying to hide something, but he couldn't figure out what it was. After a while, he came across her old notebook, which he remembered from their youth. Dorothy usually kept the numbers of close friends and a list of things to do for the week there. This time, when he accidentally saw her on the table, one name caught his eye: Marcus. It was a name he vaguely remembered from Dorothy's conversations about her youth, but he had never given it much thought. Marcus was something distant, insignificant to him, a part of her past that had nothing to do with their current life. However, now that he saw the name, James felt a strange pang of jealousy. Doubts began to grow, like a blur that took over more and more space in his mind. James tried to find a logical explanation for everything that was happening, to calm himself down, but his inner voice kept saying that something was wrong here. He began to mentally replay all her recent absences and mysterious walks. Gradually, the conviction grew stronger in his heart that there was more between Dorothy and this Marcus than just friendship. He remembered Dorothy talking about her first love, but it always seemed so far away, as if it was happening in another world. She talked about Marcus with a certain sadness and warmth, but James never saw this as a threat to their marriage. However, now that all these details began to add up to one picture, he suddenly realized that this part of her past had never completely disappeared. She continued to live inside her, as part of herself. The realization baffled him. James always believed that they had lived a life of peace and mutual understanding together. He believed that he was her only love. And now, with a completely different story unfolding before him, he felt betrayed. A couple of days later, James decided to follow Dorothy when she left the house again under the pretext of a long walk. He felt terrible, but his suspicions were too strong to ignore. He followed her at a considerable distance, watching her walk slowly down the street, as if lost in her thoughts. She reached a small park and stopped at a bench where someone else was already sitting. This someone stood up, and James instantly recognized him. It was Marcus. He saw how they greeted each other, how Marcus touched her hand, and how her face lit up in response to this gesture. This was the last straw for James. He couldn't believe his eyes. In front of him was his wife, the same woman he had lived with for 30 years, and now she was looking at another man with that warmth and joy that he hadn't seen in her gaze for a very long time. It seemed to him that his whole world was collapsing. All the years they had spent together, all their shared memories and moments, all seemed lost and meaningless in light of what he had just seen. James got home before her, but he couldn't get rid of the vision of Dorothy looking at Marcus for a second. He felt that everything inside him was turning over. The memories of their life together, how they raised children together, built a house and shared every day, now seemed to him something alien, almost deceptive. He realized that Dorothy might have always remained somewhere deep inside the other, and he had never really known her. This feeling filled him with longing, and at the same time he felt anger mixed with pain. When Dorothy returned, she noticed that James looked different. He was immersed in himself, and there was deep sadness on his face. She felt his gaze, full of understatement and anxiety, but did not dare to ask what happened. She tried to behave as usual, but her heart ached with the premonition that their lives would not be the same anymore. For James, these days were a real test. He tried to hold on, but there were questions in his head that he couldn't answer. Why did she go back to Marcus? Why did she miss him, James? All this tormented him, keeping him awake at night. He understood that Dorothy was no longer with him, that her thoughts were somewhere far away, but he did not know how to bring her back. Every night he lay next to her, feeling her warmth, and thought that a wall had grown between them that he could not overcome. Several painful days passed, full of unbearable silence and hidden tension. James still couldn't make up his mind to have a frank conversation with Dorothy, even though he knew it was inevitable. He felt betrayed, cheated, and lost, as if all the years they had spent together had been nothing more than an illusion. It seemed that every evening spent with Dorothy was saturated with an unbearable feeling of emptiness and alienness. Despite the fact that they lived under the same roof, that her scent, her touch, seemed to remain the same, something had changed subtly but forever. Every night, when they went to bed, James lay staring into the darkness, feeling her next to him, but realizing that her thoughts, her soul, were all somewhere far away. She became like a stranger. He tried to recall the images of their life together, as if he could find some clue in them that could bring Dorothy back. I remembered their youth, their children, holidays and everyday moments. All of this now seemed to be just a series of paintings, unrelated to each other. James realized that their relationship, no matter how hard he tried, was built on a routine that he had always considered reliable, but which now turned out to be an empty shell. He began to see a tinge of longing in her that he hadn't noticed before. Dorothy had always been a little thoughtful, prone to reflection, but now her gaze was absorbed in something that James could not understand. This deep sadness was mixed with a kind of inner light that he had not seen in her for a long time. Now that light belonged to someone else, and this feeling was slowly but surely devouring him from within. At some point, James decided that he could no longer remain silent. He needed to know the truth, despite all his fears. He understood that his life could change forever, but he could not live in ignorance. One evening, when Dorothy returned from another walk, he noticed how her eyes shone with a kind of secret joy, as if she carried a fire in her that was alien to their life together. This was the last straw for him. James's heart was beating heavily when he finally decided to speak. He began the conversation cautiously, trying to choose words that would not hurt her and perhaps ruin their marriage completely. But the more he tried to be careful, the clearer it became that his words, like jagged shards, were piercing into their once whole relationship. When he asked her directly what was going on, there was something like fright and at the same time relief in her eyes. He felt that it was excruciatingly difficult for her to hide her secret, and finally she realized that she would not be able to hide it anymore. Her face, which he had once known down to the smallest detail, now seemed completely unfamiliar to him. Dorothy did not cry, did not argue, did not deny that something had happened between her and Marcus. She just stared at James, trying to find words that could explain her feelings, her need for something else, for something real. But no matter what words she chose, every word felt like a hammer blow to his heart. James was aware that anger was building inside him. Anger for all the years he'd thought he knew her. Anger for all the times he'd put up with the mundane, when he hadn't tried to make changes in their lives, thinking it was acceptable for her too. He felt cheated. But the most painful thing was the realization that her needs, her personal desires, had remained a mystery to him all these years. He was shocked by how much she longed to go back to the past, how much she needed something he couldn't give her. For Dorothy, this moment was no less painful. She understood that she no longer had the right to remain silent, that her inner conflict was something that concerned not only her, but also James, with whom she had lived for many years. She struggled with herself, feeling a deep sense of guilt. At some point she realized that her duty to James, their family, their life together, all this is now under threat. She wanted to explain to him that her meetings with Marcus were not part of some insidious plan or deliberate betrayal, but were just an attempt to regain a lost sense of herself, to return to the part of herself that she had buried during the years of marriage. But no matter how she tried to express her feelings, James saw in her words only confirmation of his worst fears. He felt his trust crumbling, his belief that he was everything to her. There was genuine regret in Dorothy's eyes, but it wasn't enough for him. There was a deep-rooted feeling in his heart that everything they had together was now irretrievably lost. He saw love and pain in her eyes at the same time, but this only aggravated his own suffering, making it sharper and more unbearable. After this conversation, an unimaginable distance grew between them. It seemed that their house, once cozy and warm, was now filled with cold and tension. James couldn't get rid of thoughts of Marcus, couldn't forget the look on Dorothy's face when she confessed that this man had reawakened something in her that he hadn't seen for a long time. He understood that it was partly his fault that they were both mired in routine, but his pride and pain did not allow him to easily forgive or understand her act. The days dragged on, and they spent every evening together without saying a word. They both felt that words would be superfluous. Each of them had already said everything they could, but the silence was no less painful. James felt his love for Dorothy turning into something heavy and painful, not allowing him to leave or stay. Their every look was full of reproaches and understatement, every gesture, an accidental touch, all this became a symbol of their broken union. For Dorothy, this time became unbearable, but at the same time she realized that perhaps this was a chance for her to see what she really wanted. She felt that she could no longer be the wife who lived for comfort and habit, but at the same time she realized that she was destroying the only life she and James had created together. They were both trapped in their feelings, misunderstandings, and resentments. Everyone tried to find a way out in their own way, but all attempts only made them even more alienated from each other. Dorothy lived like in a dream, slowly and heavily, as if every new day required her to make an effort just to move forward. Anxious thoughts seemed to envelop her mind in a fog, leaving her only doubts and uncertainty about the correctness of her actions. She tried to find a balance between her life with James and her renewed love for Marcus, but instead she only plunged deeper into the chaos of her own experiences. From time to time she was overcome by the determination to leave everything behind, go back to James and try to start over from scratch. She convinced herself that stability and reliability were more important than any romantic fantasies, and that her duty to her husband, with whom they had lived most of their lives, should be stronger than fleeting passion. But every time she tried to imagine herself as a caring wife, forgetting about her personal desires, her heart literally stopped, as if she was again imprisoning herself in a familiar but already hated routine. Deep down, she knew that despite her best efforts, her relationship with James could no longer be the same as before. Their life together, of course, was full of the usual joys and sorrows that they shared while supporting each other. She knew that he was a reliable man, that he was always there for her. But when she remembered how her heart skipped a beat when she looked at Marcus, how all this family comfort and home seemed to her like a gloomy cage, she was tormented by the thought that her attraction to Marcus was tearing her apart from the inside, that her affection for James was turning into a sense of duty and responsibility, and not into the love she once felt. With each passing day, Dorothy became more and more immersed in her contradictions, trying to find a way that would not hurt anyone, but she realized that such a path simply did not exist. Whatever choice she makes, someone will get hurt, and maybe all three of them will be victims of this difficult situation. She couldn't give up on James, she couldn't break his heart, but she also couldn't forget what had awakened in her next to Marcus. There was a real battle going on in her soul between loyalty and passion, between duty and the thirst for freedom. Her house became a haunted place for her. Every single thing in it, the photos on the walls, the books on the shelves, the dishes in the kitchen, all reminded her of the years she spent with James, of all those days they lived side by side. On the one hand, she couldn't imagine her life without all these familiar things, without James, who was always her mainstay, especially in difficult times. On the other hand, every glance at familiar places and faces reminded her that perhaps she had missed something important in this life, that her dreams and ambitions had remained unfulfilled. Her thoughts returned to Marcus every time she was alone with herself. With him she was different, strong, confident, alive. He gave her something she couldn't find in her everyday life. remembering their last meetings when Marcus held her hand, when they looked at each other in complete silence. But in that silence more was said than words. She understood that he saw in her not just a woman, but a person with his own desires and aspirations. She couldn't help but think that next to him she would gain that sense of fullness that she had lost in everyday life. But at the same time she was filled with fear, the fear of losing everything she and James had created over the years. She recalled how they built a house, how they raised children together, how they helped each other in illnesses and sorrows. She knew that James was a good husband and a reliable partner, that he would never betray her. She tried to console herself with the thought that their family was something worth living for, that a fleeting infatuation with Marcus was not worth a ruined relationship with a man who had always been devoted to her. One evening, when James was late at work, Dorothy picked up an old photo album and began flipping through the pages. Her whole life was captured in these pictures, the moments they spent together, joyful and sad events, the days when they were young and happy. She looked at the photos and tried to remember what it was like to be carefree, in love, how she loved him, how they built their dreams together. But now these photos seemed to her only a reminder that her life was not entirely her own. She was aware that her feelings for James had changed, that perhaps she no longer felt the love that she had before. At some point, Dorothy realized that she needed to see Marcus again. She went to the park, knowing she could meet him there. This park became for her a symbol of her inner freedom, a place where she could be herself, without obligations and boundaries. When she arrived there, she felt a slight excitement, as if she had met him for the first time. Marcus was there, waiting for her, and in his eyes she saw the same warmth and support she had always felt around him. He hugged her, and in that embrace she felt alive again. This time, their meeting was full of silence. They sat side by side, holding hands, and each of them realized that this moment could be the last. Dorothy knew that she couldn't continue living a lie, that she had to make a decision, but this choice was too hard for her. She understood that whatever path she chose, she would have to live with the consequences of her decision. Returning home, Dorothy realized that she could no longer pretend. Her inner world was being torn apart, and it was becoming unbearable. She knew that she was going to have a difficult conversation with James, that she needed to explain to him her feelings, her pain, her contradictions. She realized that perhaps their marriage would not stand up to this conversation, but she could no longer live on hiding her true feelings. The next morning, Dorothy woke up with a determination that was mixed with a feeling of heaviness in her heart. She realized that she could no longer live in a state of expectation and uncertainty. She could not continue her gap between duty and thirst for life. Her inner voice, which had been in the shadows for so long, finally spoke with full force, demanding truth and determination. As soon as she realized that her life could not go on as before, she was overcome by a strange feeling of freedom, but also fear of what awaits her after this decision. She understood that any step she took would lead to devastating consequences, that her choice would bring pain, but she could no longer ignore herself. Dorothy realized that she had been living for others for too long, hiding her true desires and dreams behind a mask of calmness and devotion to her family. But now she had to make a choice that would change not only her life, but also the lives of James and Marcus. She spent the whole day thinking, not finding a place for herself. She considered every possible outcome of her decision, trying to figure out what was more important to her, to preserve what she had built with James, or to allow herself to immerse herself in a new life with Marcus, allowing herself the freedom that she had always lacked. But even as she tried to imagine life with Marcus, images of James, their home, their children, everything they had created together over the years invaded her mind. She felt that her life with him was real and meaningful, that their marriage, despite all the routine, was full of sincere feelings. By evening, her resolve began to weaken. It seemed to her that she was returning to her inner division again, losing control of her desires again. She understood that her future depended on finding the strength to go all the way, that if she took one wrong step, she could lose both Marcus and James and be left alone, broken and devastated. But the realization is maturing in her soul. A life without risk and without self-acceptance will not bring her happiness. Realizing this, she finally decides to talk to James, deciding to be completely honest with him, despite the fear and possible consequences. When James returned home, Dorothy met him in the living room, sitting by the window. He noticed her thoughtful, distant gaze, her hands, which were nervously intertwined in her lap. There was something unusual in her posture, in her eyes, and he felt that the moment he had been dreading all these weeks had arrived. James sat down across from her, and in the silence that hung between them, he realized that she was finally ready to tell him the whole truth. Dorothy began by explaining how her feelings had changed in recent months, how meeting Marcus had awakened in her what she thought had long been forgotten. She talked about her inner struggle, that she didn't want to hurt him, but she couldn't continue to ignore her real feelings. She was telling him the truth about her love for Marcus, about the feelings she had experienced with him, about how it made her feel like herself again. For James, her words were like blows, each of which destroyed his faith in their future together. He listened to her without interrupting, but there was pain and disappointment in his eyes. It seemed to him that his life was being destroyed right before his eyes, that every moment of their past, all the years they had spent together, had now become only fleeting memories. When she finished speaking, he got up and left without saying a word, leaving her alone. James did not return home that night. Dorothy spent it alone, sitting in the kitchen, surrounded by silence which weighed on her more and more every minute. She understood that she had ruined their relationship, that her confession had left him devastated and broken. It was hard for her to realize that her desire for freedom had led to such destruction that she had lost not only her former life, but also the person who had been with her for many years. James returned the next day. There was no longer the same softness in his eyes. His face was stony, his gaze was cold. He told her that he couldn't go on living like this, that he couldn't forgive her for betraying him. His words were harsh, but there was no malice in them, only bitterness and a sense of loss. He admitted that he felt devastated and betrayed, that he couldn't figure out how it all happened. Dorothy listened to him, realizing that their story was over, that her desire for freedom and a new life had destroyed everything they had built together. A few weeks later, James packed up and left. Dorothy was left alone in an empty house that reminded her of everything she had lost. Now her life was deprived of its former stability, and she had to re-find her way, her inner strength. She tried to justify herself by telling herself that she had done the right thing, that her choice was inevitable, but it did not bring her relief. She felt that she was alone, that her new life, which she imagined with Marcus, was not what she imagined it to be. Marcus, having learned about Dorothy's breakup with James, suggested that she move in with him, start a life together. But even in this sentence, Dorothy felt a strange sense of emptiness. She realized that her dream of freedom and happiness with Marcus was just an illusion, an attempt to escape from herself. It was hard for her to admit to herself, but she realized that her feelings for Marcus were not as deep as she thought. She began to realize that her love for him was just an attempt to return to the past, to find herself, but this attempt led her to lose the present. After a while, Dorothy decides to leave town. Her house, filled with memories, became unbearable for her. She felt that she needed to start from scratch, to find her way without James and Marcus, to find her true independence, which she had been looking for so long. A feeling of emptiness settled inside her, but at the same time it was also a feeling of liberation. She realized that her path to self was not over yet, that she had a long way to go to find her inner peace and harmony. After leaving the city, Dorothy started a new life. She traveled, met new people, tried to find herself in a new environment. She no longer aspired to a relationship, to affection. She realized that the most important thing for her was to gain inner freedom, to learn to live for herself, and not for others. A shadow of past memories remained in her heart, but now she perceived them as part of her life experience, and not as a basis for the future. It took several years before Dorothy was able to truly let go of her past. She learned to appreciate her loneliness, her inner peace, her strength. She realized that her search for freedom and happiness was part of her life path, that every decision, even if it brought pain, led her to understand herself. In the end, she found the harmony she had been looking for so long, and realized that her true happiness was in herself, and not in a relationship or attachment to someone. The morning began as usual again in the semi-darkness of the pre-dawn light that barely made its way through the thick curtains. Faint lights lit up in the kitchen, reflected in her cup of tea. Dorothy got up before James again, as she had been for several weeks. Her early opening eyes, like every movement, became an invisible beacon for James, as if they were imperceptibly changing the usual order of things. It seemed that this silence had been cozy and familiar before, but now it stretched between them like a stretched thread. Dorothy was quietly busy in the kitchen, trying not to think, but her thoughts involuntarily swirled around their recent conversations and meetings. James noticed her detachment, her fleeting glances into the distance, her detachment when she looked through the window. She often looked at the garden, which he had never redone, although he had promised many years ago. This inconspicuous garden became for her a metaphor for her life. Much was promised, but never fulfilled. Previously, these thoughts did not bring pain, but now they caused a sharp sense of loss. She knew it wasn't James's fault that her feelings had cooled, but knowing that didn't ease the mental burden. When James entered the kitchen, his gaze lingered on her for a second longer than usual. He walked slowly to the table and sat down without saying a word. It seemed that there was something of condemnation and understanding in that look at the same time. Dorothy sensed it, but she also sensed his indecision, his desire to ask something, and at the same time his fear of hearing an answer. Finally, James broke the silence.
You're up early again, aren't you?
Dorothy continued to stir her tea with a spoon, her movements becoming slightly slower, as if she was trying to stall for time, avoiding their inevitable conversation.
Yes, you do. Sometimes it's easier for me to be alone before the house is fully awake.
He looked at her with a thoughtful expression, noticing how her fingers were trembling, as if she was holding something inside.
I feel like there's something between us. It's changed. You've changed, Dorothy.
She sighed, placing the spoon on the edge of the cup. Her gaze remained fixed on the window, as if she could find the answers to all her questions behind it.
I've changed. Yeah, I guess. I just don't feel like the woman I used to be anymore, James.
And what does this mean for us?
There was sadness mixed with incomprehension in his voice. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, trying to figure out who was standing in front of him, and why this woman, whom he had known for 30 years, now seemed so far away.
I don't know, James. I don't know. It just seems to me sometimes that I missed something important. It's as if everything I once aspired to has disappeared among habits and routine tasks.
James sighed, lowering his head and thoughtfully looking at his hands intertwined on the table. He didn't know how to react to her words, didn't know what to say. He was used to her devotion, to her constancy, and now, when she seemed to be on the verge of some incomprehensible change for him, he felt cheated.
I thought we were both happy with what we have. A home, stability, children who have grown up. Isn't that what we wanted?
She chuckled softly, but there was more bitterness than joy in that grin.
Yes, James, that's exactly what I wanted, once. But sometimes I feel like I've just become part of the furniture in this house, part of this routine, and maybe that's what I wanted. And now I feel like I've lost myself.
James fell silent. He stared at her for a long time, as if he saw before him the ghost of her former dreams and ambitions, and it was bitter for him to realize that in 30 years he might not have recognized her real one. Her words cut him like a rusty knife, cutting into the very essence of their marriage.
Do you understand what you're saying? You're casting a shadow over everything we've built, everything we have. You're saying that our life was it a mistake?
Her face turned to stone. She knew that his words, like her own, had become unbearably sharp.
I'm not saying it was a mistake, James. I'm saying that all we have is that it was, and probably won't be anymore. Simply, sometimes I feel like I've never really been myself in my whole life.
He got up and walked to the window, turning his back to her. He couldn't look into her eyes, couldn't believe that she, his faithful Dorothy, thought of herself as a stranger. He wanted to ask her why she felt so lonely, why he couldn't give her what she was looking for, but he was afraid to hear the answer.
And what do you want? What are you looking for, Dorothy? Youth? Romance? What? We've lived together for so many years, and now you're saying you don't need any of this.
His words sounded bitter and disappointed. He felt rejected, not needed, as if she had already decided to leave a long time ago, but only now decided to tell him this. But instead of answering, Dorothy was silent. She just sat there, staring into her teacup, as if she could see the answers to his questions there.
I'm not looking for youth, James. I don't know how to explain it. You know, it's like I'm living according to some script that I've learned by heart a long time ago. I'm just playing a role, without real feelings. I miss myself.
She paused, trying to find words that wouldn't break his heart.
Sometimes I think that maybe I never knew what it was like to be myself. I've always been someone, a wife, a mother, a hostess. It was only when it all started to seem empty to me that I realized I didn't know who I really was.
James flinched at her words. He turned around abruptly, unable to listen to her self-deprecation and self-examination any longer. It was unbearable for him to see her like this, lost, pathetic, the woman he had always considered strong and confident.
So I wasn't the kind of person you could be yourself with? You. Couldn't you be yourself next to me? What have you been missing, Dorothy? Answer me directly.
She sighed softly, realizing that this conversation could lead them to the point of no return. But she knew she couldn't keep quiet anymore. She needed to say everything that she had been hiding in herself for too long.
I do not know, James. I do not know what I was missing, and I do not know what I need now. It's just that something has changed inside of me. It's not your problem. It's probably me. I miss myself, who I could be.
They fell silent again, and that silence hung in the air, heavy as the walls separating them. James lowered his head, feeling anger and impotence boil inside him. He wanted to scream, to accuse her of ingratitude, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. She was next to him, but at the same time so far away, as if she was standing on the other side of the river.
I always thought it would be enough to be together, build a house, support each other. But apparently that's not enough for you.
He sighed and looked at her again, trying to find something familiar in her eyes, something that had once attracted him to her. But there was only alienation and sadness in her eyes that he couldn't understand.
Maybe I really never knew you, Dorothy. But it's scary, you know. It's scary to think that everything we have might mean nothing.
Those words sent a dull ache through her heart. She knew that she had hurt him, knew that his words reflected the fear and pain that she herself had awakened. But she knew it was too late to try to change anything.
I'm scared too, James. It's scary to realize that I've lived for so many years without understanding who I really am. And it doesn't mean that I don't love you or appreciate what we have. Simply, I have to find something of my own to finally feel alive.
Her voice trailed off, and silence fell again. It had been a week since her last conversation with James, but Dorothy felt a sense of inevitability bubbling inside, as if her life was about to change completely. That day she decided to take a walk in the park, where she could afford to escape from everyday life for at least a moment and let her thoughts develop freely. The park was flooded with golden light. Autumn gradually turned the trees into warm shades, and the air was cool and clean. She walked slowly along the path, almost touching the ground, until she heard a familiar voice behind her. It was Marcus, who, noticing her in the distance, decided to come over and say hello. When their eyes met, they stopped for a moment, and silence hung between them.
Dorothy. You again. I didn't expect to see you here at all.
You know, sometimes it feels like I'm just walking in circles. This park has become something like that for me. Salvation. I can get away from everything for a little bit here.
She lowered her gaze, as if she was afraid that her eyes would betray her inner torment. But Marcus caught this mood, as if he had read her thoughts.
You still look like the first time we met here, Dorothy. Only now there is something new in your eyes. Something dark. What's happening? You know you can trust me.
His voice was soft, as it had been when they were young. Dorothy suddenly felt her throat constrict and the words stuck on her tongue. But she understood that she could no longer hide her feelings, she could no longer keep them to herself. She took a deep breath and slowly released it, as if trying to relieve at least some of this weight.
Sometimes I feel like I'm confused. I feel like I can't stay where I am now, but I can't leave either. It's like a cage that I'm trying to break out of, but its walls are getting tighter and tighter.
Marcus nodded, listening intently, and there was something in his eyes that made her continue. Her voice was low, as if she was afraid that the wrong ears would hear her, or that this confession would break the silence in which they stood.
What's stopping you? You've always been brave. You've always moved forward, even if it scared you. What has changed, Dorothy?
Everything has changed, Marcus. I have a family, children, a house. James, we've lived together for so many years. Sometimes I feel like I'm betraying not only him, but everyone around me, even myself. But at the same time, I feel that if I continue to live the way I used to live, I will lose myself completely.
Marcus was looking at her intently, and there was something in his gaze that both excited and alarmed her. He understood her, but he also knew that her pain was deeper than she could put into words. He walked slowly over to her and gently put his hand on her shoulder.
You don't have to live for what's expected of you, Dorothy. You're a human being too. You deserve to be happy too. Isn't that important?
Her heart sank at his words. She had always considered herself a faithful wife, a caring mother, but now it seemed to her that for this concern for others she had betrayed herself. She looked at Marcus and felt tormented by the question she was afraid to ask.
What if everything I did was to meet expectations? What if? Have I never been really happy? Maybe I just needed to convince myself that I was happy with my life because that's the way it's done.
Marcus frowned, feeling her pain. He knew he couldn't answer that question for her, but he understood that she was suffering, and it made him feel pain too. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice low and deep.
Then why don't you try to live a different life, Dorothy? Why not let yourself be yourself at least once? Let yourself. Dreaming like before.
Dorothy, hearing these words, turned away. She couldn't get enough air. She felt that every sentence of Marcus was becoming a challenge for her. She knew she had to find answers inside herself, but she was afraid to admit that she didn't know what she really wanted.
And if it's easy? An illusion, Marcus? If all I feel is just running away from what's eating me? If I'm just trying to escape and not solve my problems?
Marcus looked at her thoughtfully, trying to find the words to give her some comfort.
Maybe it's an illusion. But Dorothy, sometimes it's moments like this that give us answers that we haven't been able to find for years. You shouldn't blame yourself for living, and if this is an escape, then so be it. We all run away sometimes to get back to ourselves.
His words penetrated deeper than he could have imagined. Dorothy realized that for her these feelings were not just a hobby or a moment of nostalgia, it was an opportunity to find herself again, an opportunity to live outside the framework that she had imposed on herself. But her inner conflict did not allow her to simply give up everything she had created with James. She looked at Marcus and saw that he was ready to support her, but she understood that this was her own path, and no one could walk it for her.
I know, Marcus. But sometimes it seems to me that if I choose this path, I will lose everything I have, everything that James and I have built. How can I leave everything like that?
Marcus looked at her with genuine sympathy. He understood that for her it was a choice between duty and freedom, and that her every thought was now connected with this gap. He couldn't take on her pain, but he wanted to give her at least some support.
You don't have to decide now, Dorothy. Just give yourself some time. Allow yourself to be honest, at least with yourself. There is no need to rush to answers. All I ask is that you don't betray your feelings.
She felt that weight on her heart again. She knew that his words were correct, but she also understood that her fear was the fear of change, the fear of destroying everything she had built over the years. That fear had become a part of her, and now she felt she couldn't get rid of it.
Marcus, what if it's not just fear? What if I can't live without James? After all, for so long I lived for him, for our family. I'm not sure I can be happy by destroying it all.
His gaze was soft and full of understanding. He knew that her pain was real, that she was really afraid of change. He squeezed her hand gently, looking into her eyes.
You don't have to decide everything now, Dorothy. Just let yourself feel it. Don't give up on yourself for the sake of duty if it brings you suffering. Sometimes the only way to understand what's important to us is to let ourselves experience it.
Those words awakened something deep in her, something she had long forgotten. She realized that her inner conflict is not just a choice between two people, it is a struggle for her own freedom, for the right to be herself. She was afraid of this freedom because she did not know what it would lead to, but now she realized that it was impossible to continue living in a state where she was forced to deny her feelings.
It seems to me that I've been hiding behind a role and responsibilities for so long that now I don't know how to get back to myself. I'm afraid that if I let myself be myself, I won't be able to go back.
Marcus looked at her with a slight smile, his voice low but confident.
And maybe you don't need to go back, Dorothy. Maybe forward is the only direction you need right now. But it's your choice, and yours alone.
She closed her eyes, feeling her heart beating in a frenzied rhythm. These words sounded true, but also scary. She understood that this was not just her own struggle, but something that concerned everyone around her. But she also realized that she couldn't keep pretending anymore.
Thank you, Marcus. I do not know what will happen next, but thank you for being here. For not letting me forget who I am.
Marcus touched her hand gently, his touch was warm. And there was so much support in it that she hadn't felt in a long time.
Always, Dorothy. I will always be here to remind you of that.
They sat side by side in silence for a long time, feeling the silence of the autumn park, and each of them realized that this silence was filled with all their words, all their secrets and fears. It's been a few days since Dorothy and Marcus met in the park. She returned home deeply immersed in her thoughts, and once again tried to figure out what choice she had to make. Her inner conflict became more acute, and although she tried to behave as usual, James noticed that her gaze became somehow detached, as if her soul was far away from their home. James, tormented by suspicion and growing anxiety, could no longer remain silent. He felt that the moment had come for a conversation that had been begging for a long time, but which he postponed for fear of destroying the delicate peace that still remained between them. However, his patience was running out, and he decided to find out what was going on with his wife. One evening, when Dorothy returned from a walk, James was sitting in the living room, lost in thought. He heard her footsteps in the hallway, and when she entered, he looked at her with restraint. There was tension between them, which they both felt, but neither dared to break. James sighed, gathering his strength.
Dorothy, we need to talk.
Her heart sank, and she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She knew this moment was inevitable, but she didn't think it would come so soon. She sat down quietly in front of him, not looking up, as if she was afraid that her gaze would betray her thoughts.
About what, James?
He looked at her intently, and there was so much pain and doubt in his gaze that she could no longer avoid his gaze. He saw her every move, every breath, and finally asked the question that had been tormenting him for a long time.
Are you seeing someone, Dorothy? Tell me the truth. I can't live in guesses anymore.
Her heart stopped, and at that moment she realized that she no longer had the strength to hide the truth. But the words couldn't come out of her mouth, as if every letter was made of guilt and pain. She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible.
Yes, James, I was dating someone. But it's not what you think it is.
James flinched at her confession, but tried to remain calm. His heart was pounding so loudly that he could barely hear his own thoughts, but he knew he had to figure it out to the end.
Who is he? Who is this person for whom you decided to push me away and everything we have?
She looked at him with an expression of guilt, and her gaze was full of regret. She didn't want to hurt him, but she knew that there was no turning back, that her words would destroy everything they had built together.
His name is Marcus. He was my first love. I met him by chance a few weeks ago, and all this stirred up those feelings that I had long considered lost.
James chuckled bitterly, feeling pain and jealousy fill his heart. He hadn't expected her words to provoke such a strong reaction. It seemed to him that their marriage was solid, but now he realized that his confidence was an illusion.
So you've chosen your first love. How many years have passed? Do you really think you can just go back to feeling like we didn't matter all these years?
His words tore her apart. She knew he was right, her actions might seem pointless, but the feeling she felt defied logic. She felt her heart torn between duty and what she believed to be the truth about herself.
James, this is not what you think it is. I never wanted to betray you or ruin our marriage. I feel like something inside me has been lost. Ever since I met Marcus, I've started to remember the self I used to be before. Became the one you know now.
James frowned, his voice harsh, filled with reproach and disappointment.
And how, Dorothy, could you live with me all these years if you felt like someone else? Do you think we've been strangers all this time? Didn't our lives matter to you?
Her eyes filled with tears, and she couldn't hold back her feelings any longer. She knew that every sentence she said would only hurt him, but she couldn't continue to live a lie.
James, our lives mattered to me. Everything we have is important to me, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm lost. I do not know how to explain it in a way that you understand. I just felt like I wasn't myself anymore. Marcus, he reminded me who I am.
James stood up abruptly, clenching his fists and looking at her with rage and pain. He wanted to scream, to blame her for ruining their union, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to ease his pain.
You talk about yourself like it's the most important thing. What about us? Dorothy? What about me? Haven't I ever supported you? Wasn't I there for you when you needed help? And now you're telling me that some man from the past made you remember who you are. Do you even realize how humiliating this is?
His words stabbed into her like knives, and she felt her guilt getting heavier. She couldn't deny that he was right, but she also understood that her feelings couldn't just be thrown out of her heart.
I know it's not fair, James. I can't justify my actions, but they don't make my condition any less real. I can't ignore the fact that I don't feel alive anymore.
James turned away, clasping his hands behind his head, trying to contain his emotions. He felt that he had lost her, that everything he had aspired to in their marriage was now ruined by her confession.
So what now, Dorothy? Will you just leave to find your true self? Will you leave me, our family, everything that we built?
Dorothy closed her eyes, feeling tears running down her cheeks. She knew that she could no longer continue to live in this gap between her feelings and duty. She knew she had to make a choice, but it was a painful choice.
I do not know, James. I do not know how to do the right thing. I don't want to leave you, but I can't go on living as if nothing has changed inside of me.
He slowly turned to her, his eyes filled with pain and despair.
You can't have both, Dorothy. You have to choose. I'm not ready to be part of a marriage where one of us has already passed away. If you choose Marcus, then it will be the end for us.
Those words seemed to cut through her heart. She knew that by continuing to meet with Marcus, she was destroying everything that had been between her and James, but she also knew that by abandoning Marcus, she would betray herself. Her voice was barely audible, but it contained the full weight of her struggle.
I'm not asking you to understand me, James, but please believe that I don't want to hurt you. I'm just trying to figure out how to live with myself.
James took a deep breath, looking at her with an expression that was a mixture of pain, anger, and impotence. It seemed to him that his whole world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it.
Then decide, Dorothy, because I can't live in this between. Either you're with me, or you're not here anymore.
Dorothy sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the floor, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She knew that the moment of truth had come, but her heart was bursting with fear of this choice. Autumn brought down cold rains on the city, which made the streets more grey and inhospitable every day. Dorothy returned home with the feeling that her own life, like this city, was sinking into a dullness from which there was no escape. The meetings with Marcus continued, but now the painful question arose more and more clearly in her head and heart: what does this really mean? What role does Marcus play in her life now, the one that was once meaningful to her, or just the embodiment of nostalgia that keeps her in the past? The first meetings with Marcus were like a breath of fresh air for Dorothy, as if she had opened a window and let a long-forgotten cool wind into a stuffy room. His words and touches made her feel alive. Awakened in her the energy that she had been losing for years, mired in the familiar family routine. Marcus reminded her not only of the romance of her youth, but also of the dream she was building then, of the aspirations she had before she chose another path: stability and predictability with James. But as the meetings continued, Dorothy's feelings became more complicated. She was no longer sure that she was looking for the passion in Marcus that could give her happiness. Rather, her connection with him became something else, a kind of reminder of what she was missing. Her heart was torn between two worlds. One is a world of stability and familiarity, where James is waiting for her, and the other is a world of old memories, where every look from Marcus reminds her of who she once was, while she could still choose her future without regard to obligations. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her attraction to Marcus was not so much love as an attempt to regain her lost sense of freedom. Once upon a time, he was everything to her, the embodiment of passion, romance, the promise of a life filled with movement and discovery. But now, looking at him, she realized that their connection was an illusion, an attempt to bring back a past that could no longer be revived. In him, she was looking not so much for love, but for the opportunity to return that part of herself that she had buried long ago. At some point, this realization hurt her, as if Marcus, who had been her salvation, suddenly turned out to be a reminder of her own losses and sacrifices. He symbolized what she couldn't keep when she chose to live with James. He was a reflection of her youth, her ambitions and dreams, but he was not a real person with whom she could become truly happy again. At some point, Dorothy realized that her connection with Marcus was not love, but an escape, a way to escape from the responsibility and pain she felt while in a marriage that had become a routine for her. She began to think that her marriage to James was not a mistake at all, that the years spent with him were not wasted. Their relationship filled her life not with the sharpness and passion that she had in her youth, but with a quiet, steady devotion that over the years became their foundation. James became for her the person with whom she shared everything: joys, sorrows, worries and worries. Yes, their marriage hadn't had the spark she'd once seen in Marcus for a long time, but that didn't mean her life with James was any less meaningful. The realization shocked her to the core. She began to think that maybe she was attracted to Marcus only because he represented something she had once missed. He was for her an image of her own youth, a part of her unfulfilled dreams, and perhaps she became attached to him precisely because she saw in him what she had lost. But she also understood that their bond could not replace what she had created with James. They had a common story, full of trials and overcoming difficulties, which connected them much deeper than just passion and romance. This outburst of sincerity was painful for her, but it brought some relief. She realized that her feelings for Marcus were nothing more than a reflection of her inner dissatisfaction, and not true love. Her attraction to him was a way to fill the void that had arisen in her soul due to her own loss of self. But now she realized that returning to Marcus would not give her happiness, it would only drag her deeper into the illusion. Real happiness should not have been in the outside, but inside her. These thoughts pierced her, and she returned home with a feeling of relief and at the same time longing. Now she knew she had to start a conversation with James. She had to admit that her quest was just an escape. She realized that, despite all the difficulties, her place was next to him, and that their relationship needed not a break, but a new look, honesty and openness that had been lost over the years. That night, when Dorothy realized the true nature of her feelings for Marcus, she couldn't sleep. Her mind wandered around everything that had happened in recent weeks' meetings with Marcus, their conversations, the awakening of old memories, the unexpected internal conflict that had arisen between her past and present. She felt herself inexorably drawn to talking to James now. It was impossible to avoid, and she realized that she had to be honest with him, even if the truth hurt both her and him. The long silence between them became unbearable, weighing on her soul like a heavy burden that could not be rid of. The next morning, Dorothy felt unaccustomed confidence, although she knew that this conversation would be one of the most difficult in her life. There was a mixture of fear and relief in her soul. She was afraid to destroy their usual way of life, but at the same time she was tormented by the feeling that she could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. For many years she hid her true feelings and suppressed her discontent, trying to convince herself that her life was right and complete. But now, faced with the truth about herself, she realized that she had to give James a chance to hear her thoughts, her pain, and her doubts. This is the only way they can decide if their marriage has a future. When Dorothy finally decided to talk, she noticed how intensely James was listening to her words. With each confession, with each admission of her pain and loss, his face grew more serious. She told him about her feelings, about her meetings with Marcus, about how memories of the past had awakened long-forgotten dreams and ambitions in her. She explained that her desire for Marcus was not true love, but rather a desire to regain a lost sense of freedom. It was a confession she could hardly accept herself, and it hurt her to see how her words hurt James. At the same time, as she said it all out loud, she realized that her feelings for James had never been truly lost. Their relationship had changed, become more complicated, overgrown with many layers of everyday worries and habits, but they were still meaningful to her. However, she could not ignore the fact that for many years she had suppressed her desires and ambitions for the sake of her family. She understood that her marriage was strong, but this strength turned into a cage for her, in which she stopped feeling alive. James, hearing her confession, felt his world crumble. He understood that their life was far from perfect, but he always believed in their union, that their common values and support for each other were the foundation that could not be destroyed. For him, their marriage was a source of strength and stability, and now he was suddenly faced with a reality in which his wife, his partner for so many years, felt like a stranger. He felt betrayed and humiliated. It hurt him to realize that Dorothy had found solace in another person, even if not in love, but in a simple search for herself. As Dorothy spoke her thoughts out loud, she began to realize how important this conversation was not only for James, but also for herself. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to speak honestly, without trying to hide her feelings or adjust to his expectations. She had been prepared for the fact that her confession could lead to a breakup, but now she realized that the most important thing for her was this honesty. She saw that years of habit and tacit agreement between them had made their relationship shallow, devoid of depth and sincerity. And although she was afraid of losing James, she realized that she could no longer live in the shadow of her hidden feelings and unexpressed desires. James, although he felt anger and pain, began to realize that a lot of things needed to be reconsidered in their relationship. He understood that they were both playing their roles, content with a superficial harmony that actually hid their discontent and disappointment. They both became hostages of their responsibilities, the desire for stability, but in the end, it made their union fragile and lifeless. James began to realize that his own needs and desires had also been forgotten in this struggle for a normal life, and that his sense of stability was just an illusion. After long hours of frank conversation, they both felt that they had reached a new point from which there was no turning back. It was a moment of reassessment of their marriage, their life together, and themselves. They realized that they couldn't just go back to their old lives without making profound changes. They realized that their relationship does not need to be preserved for the sake of habit or duty. It must be genuine, sincere, and free from lies and prejudice. Dorothy and James eventually decided to separate, realizing that their marriage had become an obstacle for each of them to self-realization and the search for happiness. It was a difficult decision, but it gave them a chance for a new life, for the opportunity to regain the freedom and independence that they had lost. It was a release for Dorothy. She felt that she could finally start a life in which she didn't have to suppress her desires. James, despite the pain and disappointment, also realized that now he has a chance to reconsider his priorities, learn to be honest with himself. The breakup with James turned out to be an important stage in Dorothy's spiritual growth. She realized that she was looking for something in her relationship with Marcus that she lacked in herself, and that now she had to rebuild her life, without attachments and illusions. After parting with James, Dorothy was left alone in their family home, which now seemed to her not a cozy shelter, but a cold shadow of the past. The rooms were filled with memories that had become a part of her life, the photographs on the walls, the furniture they chose together, and the little things that had made up their life together for many years. Every corner of the house was saturated with the past, which now became a heavy burden for her. She understood that if she stayed here, she would not be able to move forward, facing every day a reminder of the life she had left behind. After much thought, Dorothy decided to leave the house and leave. This decision did not come easy to her. She was afraid to start from scratch, to leave a place that was a symbol of stability and security. But she also knew that it was this stability that was for her the cage from which she had been striving to escape for so long. Now that she was free of obligations, it seemed to her that for the first time in many years she could manage her life the way she wanted. She packed her things and left the house, leaving behind everything that reminded her of the past. Dorothy went to the small coastal town that she and James had once dreamed of, but never found the time to visit. Now she has decided that this place will become her new home. She rented a small apartment overlooking the sea and began to settle into this new world for her. Her days became simple and calm, filled with walks along the shore and reading books that she had not had time for before. She studied the city, got to know the locals, and tried to find a new occupation for herself that would give her joy and a sense of meaning. At first, loneliness was not easy for her. Dorothy was used to being with James, sharing her thoughts and worries with him, and now she was surrounded by silence, which was broken only by the sounds of the sea. However, as the days turned into weeks, she began to appreciate this silence. She didn't have to adjust to anyone's expectations, she didn't have to follow a schedule or obey a routine. This time was an opportunity for her to return to herself, to who she used to be, before marriage and all obligations. She began to rediscover the simple joys of life that had previously eluded her. At first, she felt guilty about her choice. She felt like she had destroyed something that was important to her and to James. She often wondered how he was coping, how he was going through their breakup, and felt the pain of realizing that she had brought him suffering. But she also understood that their breakup was inevitable, that both of them had long lost the sincerity in their relationship that they should have kept. Now she realized that her choice was a step towards gaining inner freedom, and every day this thought strengthened in her heart. Gradually, her life began to take on a new rhythm. She signed up for painting courses, which she had long dreamed of attending, but which she had never found time for. Inspired by the nature and tranquility of the coastal city, she began to paint landscapes, people, and the moments she saw around her. This activity became a source of joy and satisfaction for her. She felt that art helped her express the emotions she had been suppressing for so long. Through paints and a brush, she explored her inner state, and each new drawing filled her life with meaning. Over time, she began to make new acquaintances, participate in city events, and communicate with people who inspired her with their life experiences. These were people who, like her, were looking for peace and harmony. Many of them had moved to this city to start life from scratch, and their stories gave her hope. She began to appreciate her loneliness as a gift that allowed her to be honest with herself, listen to her inner voice, and follow her desires. She no longer felt like she was living for someone else. Her life belonged to her alone. A few months after moving in, Dorothy began to notice how her perception of the world had changed. She stopped worrying about the past, stopped thinking about what would have happened if her life had turned out differently. Her past with James now seemed to be part of the path that had brought her to this moment. She realized that every decision she made, every event in her life was necessary for her to find herself. Her memories no longer caused pain. Now she saw in them lessons and experiences that helped her become stronger. It took several years before Dorothy fully found inner harmony. She realized that happiness does not come from external circumstances, but is born from the depths of her soul, from the ability to accept herself as she is. Now her life was filled with peace and tranquility. She felt that she had found her place in this world, that her path was not just a search for external success or recognition, but the ability to be in harmony with herself. Sometimes, walking along the coast, she caught herself thinking that she did not feel regret. The past with James no longer hurt her. It had become something important and dear, but now it was like a distant shore that she did not want to return to. One quiet evening she received a letter from James. His words were full of calmness and understanding. He thanked her for the years they had spent together and talked about the new life he had started after their separation. Dorothy smiled, feeling that they had both found what they were looking for, each their own path, on which they could be honest and free. This world, this city and her life became a new home for her, a home that was built on true sincerity and peace with herself. It had been several weeks since Dorothy had last seen Marcus. After their parting conversation in the park, she tried to return to her usual life, waking up next to James, cooking breakfast, meeting the evening in tacit agreement, as if nothing had happened. However, every day in their house felt unbearably heavy, as if an invisible shadow lay between her and James, separating them. Even the walls seemed to remember her torment. Every corner of their house was saturated with feelings that she could no longer hide. Nevertheless, she tried to maintain the usual order of things, hoping that time would heal her doubts and erase the feelings caused by the meeting with Marcus. James also noticed a change in his wife's behavior. He was not blind. Even before her revelations, he realized that changes had taken place in her life. At one point, he was sure that Dorothy had made a choice in favor of the family, but every day this confidence weakened. It seemed that her soul was so far away that he saw only a shell in front of him, pretending that everything was fine. Every conversation they had, or even a brief glance at each other, brought awkwardness and alienation. One such morning, when Dorothy got up before James again to face the beginning of the day alone, he decided that he could no longer live in this limbo. James made himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Dorothy at the kitchen table. She felt his gaze, but continued to silently stir her tea with a spoon, as if trying to avoid conversation.
Every morning I look at you, and it seems to me that you are not with me. It's like you're not here at all, but somewhere very far away, Dorothy. You've become a ghost in this house, in our lives.
She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words, not wanting to escalate the situation once again.
I'm trying, James. Truth, I need time to sort everything out in my head to figure out where I am.
Time? How much of it do you need? I'm right here. But I don't think you notice me, Dorothy. It's like you're waiting for something or someone, but certainly not for me.
Her face turned to stone. She heard the accusation in his words, which he did not dare to say out loud. He had been trying to be patient all this time, but now she could feel the anger rising in his voice. She knew that this conversation was inevitable, but at the same time she was terribly afraid of him.
It's hard for me to explain this, James. I want to be with you, but sometimes I feel like I'm lost. I look at myself and I don't understand who I am. It's like I'm stuck in the past. It's like everything that once filled my life with meaning has disappeared.
Are you sure these aren't just empty excuses? Maybe you really just don't want to be here? You think that if it weren't for the kids, not the house, then everything would be different, right? Would you have chosen a different path?
His voice was trembling, and Dorothy felt that her answers could be the beginning of the end. She didn't know how to explain to him what she was feeling, how to admit that her meeting with Marcus had been a temptation for her, making her doubt every moment of their marriage.
I do not know, James. Sometimes I feel like I was living in a dream, that everything I aspired to, I left behind for something else, something that I thought was right. But now I'm not sure I even understand what it means to be myself.
So you haven't been honest with me all this time. Did you live out of habit instead of trying to figure yourself out and tell the truth? I understand that we had different problems, but Dorothy, I was always sure that you were mine. I didn't know you felt like a stranger.
She closed her eyes, feeling how each of his phrases hurt her. She wanted to scream that it wasn't his fault, that her doubts and her emptiness weren't about him, but about herself. But she couldn't find the words to explain it in a way that he would understand.
You've never been wrong, James. I also thought that you were my support, my stability. But sometimes I can't get rid of the feeling that over all these years I've forgotten who I really am. All I see around me is routine, habit, everyday life. I can't be honest with you if I'm not honest with myself.
James pushed the cup away and clasped his hands so tightly that his fingers turned white. He looked at her for a long time, as if trying to figure out what made her change her views on their marriage, on their life. He always believed that they were both happy with what they had, that their lives were full and meaningful.
So our house, the kids, what we built, it doesn't matter to you. Or maybe you're just tired of it. Do you think that you could have lived a brighter, richer life if you had chosen a different path? Or if you met someone else, like, for example, Marcus?
He couldn't bring himself to say his name calmly. This whole conversation revolved around innuendos and hidden jealousy, which he so diligently suppressed.
Marcus has nothing to do with this, James. It's not about him. I'm looking for myself, not love, not someone else who could fill this void. I need to understand who I am when I'm not playing someone else's role.
Then why can't you find yourself with me? Why can't you be yourself next to the person you've spent 30 years of your life with?
His voice was quieter, but there was a pain in it that she couldn't help but notice. It was difficult for her to explain that her internal crisis did not directly affect their life together, that it was the result of all the years in which she ignored her own needs for the sake of responsibilities and expectations.
I do not know, James. I really don't know. I look at you and I see a man who has always been there for me. I feel respect and affection for you. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I stopped understanding what it means to live for myself.
James frowned, something between despair and anger flashing in his eyes. He couldn't believe that for so many years he had been just a part of some role for her, that her love wasn't as deep as he thought.
So I was just a part of your performance? Well, Dorothy, I don't think I want to be an actor in this. If you can't live for our lives for us, then what do you need?
I understand how it sounds. It pains me to see that you think it's your fault. That's not so. You didn't do anything wrong. You were there for me, supporting me. But it seems to me that if I don't find myself, I will lose my meaning. And then I'll just be a shadow that you'll tolerate out of pity or habit.
James got up and walked to the window, looking out into the distance, as if trying to find the answer to his questions in this emptiness. It seemed to him that his life, his marriage, was collapsing right before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it.
If you want to be alone, say so. If it's your decision to leave everything behind, then why not?
Can't you just leave? Why torment us both with this expectation and false hopes? His words pierced her, and for a second she really wanted to leave everything and leave. But she understood that her feelings for James had not completely disappeared, that she still valued him as a part of her life.
James, I'm only asking for a little time. I don't want to leave, but if I stay without finding an answer, it will be worse for both of us.
He was silent for a long time, and finally sighed heavily, like a man who accepted the inevitable.
All right, Dorothy, but know that I can't wait forever. And if it's important for you to be with someone else or to be alone with yourself, I won't keep you. I don't want to live with a man who doesn't know why he's here.
It's been a week since Dorothy and James had their honest conversation in the kitchen. Despite their attempts to continue life as before, every day became more difficult for them. After many years of living together, when familiar roles seemed natural, their house was filled with heavy silence and inattention. Dorothy felt herself becoming more and more consumed by a feeling of emptiness, loneliness and dissatisfaction, and deep down she knew that her attempts to find herself had led her to even greater disappointment. She started thinking about Marcus again. Memories of him began to return, not as nostalgia for the romantic past, but as a kind of symbol of lost opportunities. She increasingly wondered, what if I had chosen a different path? What if I hadn't abandoned my youthful passion then, but followed my dreams? These thoughts about her youth, about the times when her life was not yet bound by obligations, became something of an obsession for her. She felt that two worlds were fighting in her soul, her current life with James, which seemed familiar, stable, but at the same time empty, and the image of the past, which in her memory was full of romance and unfulfilled desires. On the day when it was especially difficult for her, she decided to go to the park to distract herself from her thoughts and try to find solace alone with nature. The park had been her favorite place since childhood. It remained unchanged, no matter how her own life changed. Here she could indulge in memories and dreams without fear of condemnation. Rustling through the fallen autumn leaves, Dorothy felt that the past she had once left was still living inside her, and this realization filled her with both bitterness and a strange sense of guilt. Walking along the familiar alleys, she felt eyes on her and turned to see Marcus. It was an unexpected, but at the same time such a natural meeting. It seemed that fate had brought them back to each other. At that moment, her heart stopped. She wanted to run away and stay. Everything she was trying to suppress in herself, memories, emotions, all came out. She saw in his eyes a reflection of the youth she had once lived, of those dreams that had once been the meaning of her existence. Their meeting awakened in her the very feelings that she thought she had left in the past. After this meeting with Marcus, Dorothy could no longer find peace. Her thoughts and feelings were mixed up, creating confusion and excitement in her soul. She understood that the memories of Marcus were not just a longing for a lost love, it was a longing for a lost part of herself, for those dreams that she had never realized. It was the realization that her young aspirations and desires had been stifled, suppressed by life's responsibilities, and now, years later, her soul screamed about them, no matter how painful it was to realize it. She thought more and more about how she was then, young, full of energy and ideas, when every day was a new beginning. Now, returning home to James, she felt more and more detached. There seemed to be a huge gap between them, and every time they tried to talk, the gap grew wider. Their conversations became shorter and shorter, and even the most ordinary topics were discussed with strained politeness. Dorothy felt that the more she thought about Marcus, the more she was moving away from James. She could not share her thoughts and feelings with him. Something personal, something deeply intimate, settled in her heart, and this feeling alienated her from her husband. As time went on, her thoughts about Marcus became more and more intrusive. She remembered his look, his voice, which so easily opened the way for her to her own memories and dreams. She felt like that young woman again, full of plans and energy, and now realized how much she had to lose to fit the role she had assumed in her marriage to James. Her heart was bursting with contradictions. She knew that her feelings for Marcus were only a reflection of her own dissatisfaction and longing for what she had lost, but at the same time she could not get rid of the desire to meet him again, to feel alive again, the way she once was. She increasingly began to look for reasons to leave home to spend time alone. Her walks became longer and longer, and she began to return to the park, hoping to see Marcus again. Dorothy understood that her desire to be with him was a kind of escape, but she could no longer resist this impulse. Her old life, her role as a wife and mother, seemed increasingly alien to her, and when she was alone, she felt more free than she had ever felt in recent years. Marcus became for her not just a man from the past, but the embodiment of those ideals and dreams that she had once betrayed. He was a reminder of her own aspirations, of what she had once wanted from life. Now that she had met him again, she saw in front of her not just a former love, but a whole world of opportunities that she had once missed. She knew that her feelings for him were an illusion, but this illusion became the only way for her to find herself in this crisis. With each passing day, Dorothy realized that her inner conflict could not be solved by simply returning to her old life. Her feelings for Marcus were not just a memory, it was her inner reflection. She saw in him not the man she had once loved, but her own longing, her pain and her unfulfilled dreams. Marcus had become a mirror for her, in which she saw herself, a woman who had lost herself in cares and responsibilities, and now she realized that she could not live on without understanding her feelings and desires. Deep down, she began to realize that her attraction to Marcus was not true love. It was a reminder of her own inner world, of her dreams and aspirations that she had ignored for so long. Marcus became for her not a person, but a symbol of her own capabilities, her lost freedom. She realized that if she wants to find herself, she must stop looking for the answer in other people, in the illusions of the past, and focus on her own path, on who she really wants to be. Gradually, Dorothy came to realize that her path to self lies through overcoming illusions and returning to herself. She realized that her feelings for Marcus were just a reflection of her own dissatisfaction, her longing for what she had lost. Now she knew that she had to give up this illusion in order to finally find herself and live her life without looking back at the past. Several days have passed since Dorothy and Marcus last met in the park. She returned home feeling an inner storm. All her attempts to forget about this meeting were useless. The image of Marcus and their conversation remained in her head, like a reminder that she was now torn between two paths in life. But at the same time, all this emotional upheaval made her look at her own life more clearly than ever. The internal conflict became more acute. It was impossible to ignore it, and she could no longer live pretending that she did not understand what she was missing. The daily routine now seemed like a heavy burden to her. Her home, a place that once gave her a sense of comfort and security, began to put pressure on her. She walked through the rooms, feeling like everything reminded her of the past, of all the years she had spent with James. Every detail of the interior, every object in the house symbolized the familiar and well-established order that she herself created. Now this order seemed to lose its meaning. She no longer felt like the mistress of her own home, and her role as a wife and mother seemed more like a duty than a part of her personality. Dorothy began to realize that her mental conflict was undermining her from the inside every day. The old stability that had once been so dear to her was now perceived as a heavy burden. She had to admit that her family life was no longer satisfying. Instead of joy and peace, she felt an emptiness so deeply ingrained that it was impossible to get rid of it. But she knew she couldn't blame James for her suffering. It wasn't him who created this void. It wasn't his fault that she felt so lost. James, of course, noticed her detachment. He knew Dorothy well enough to feel the changes happening to her. Their relationship had long been strained, and he was increasingly confused by her behavior. She was slipping away from him, as if something was pulling her to another place. And despite all his efforts to maintain the atmosphere of a normal family life, their house was filled with tension that could be felt even in the air. Every word, every look was now perceived as a possible beginning of another conflict. They both locked themselves in their experiences, and this only made the situation worse. One evening, when Dorothy returned from a walk, James met her in the living room. He was sitting in an armchair, looking away, and his face expressed fatigue and confusion. He had obviously been thinking for a long time about what was going on between them, and at that moment he could no longer remain silent. He felt it was time to ask her the question that had been tormenting him for a long time: what was going on with their marriage? Dorothy froze at his question. She had long expected this conversation to take place sooner or later, but she was not ready for it. She knew that her feelings for Marcus and all her doubts about marriage had become obvious to James. It became clear to her that she could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized that this conversation could lead them to the point of no return, that perhaps her relationship with James would never be the same. She knew that an honest answer would hurt him, but she also knew that if she kept quiet any longer, it would destroy them both. Anxiety and guilt mixed in her soul, because she knew that her doubts had already led to a crack in their relationship. It was hard to admit that it was her internal conflict and her meetings with Marcus that had caused their estrangement. She tried to find the words to explain to James what was going on inside her, but she couldn't find the right phrases. Every time she wanted to say something, all she could think of was guilt. And then she decided to take a chance to tell him about her doubts, without trying to embellish the truth. The words came out slowly, carefully, as if each of them represented a small confession. She explained to him that she could not get rid of the feeling that somewhere along the way she had lost herself, that her life had become empty, and the role of wife and mother was just the fulfillment of other people's expectations. Dorothy admitted that she is afraid to face the truth, but also understands that she can no longer live in this world where she is a stranger to herself. James sat in silence, listening intently to her, and with every word she said, he felt more and more hurt. He felt his world crumbling, as everything he thought was solid and unshakable was suddenly under threat. He had always thought that their marriage was a home based on trust, love and support, and now he realized that he had been blind to her real feelings. It hurt him to think that she felt lonely, that she had lost herself next to him. Anger, resentment, and a sense of betrayal were mixed in his soul, but he did not let them overwhelm him. Dorothy, as she said these words, realized that she was not only opening up to James but also to herself. She finally allowed herself to understand that her dissatisfaction was not something temporary. Her feelings for Marcus, their meetings and conversations only highlighted what she had long ignored. She couldn't blame James because her struggle was internal, and she knew it would be a mistake to look for an answer somewhere outside. This conversation with him was necessary so that she could get out of the illusion and no longer hide behind the role she played in this marriage. When she finished speaking, there was a heavy silence in the room. They both felt her weight, as if the air had become denser, and it was hard to breathe. James sat motionless, staring at one point. His heart was overflowing with emotions, but he knew that he would not be able to express everything he felt at once. His first reaction was anger, a desire to accuse her of hiding her real feelings. He wanted to tell her that all these years he had been trying to be a support for her, that he loved her, but now he did not see reciprocation. However, he knew that there would be no truth in this, because somewhere deep down he understood that he himself was to blame for their separation. Suddenly he realized that over the years of living together, they had both become victims of habit and routine. James realized that for many years they had been living according to scenarios that they had imposed on themselves. He was her anchor, her support, but he didn't see her as the person she really was. And although he could not understand the depth of her inner crisis, he suddenly felt that their problems were not only her fault. He was also part of this vicious circle where they both put duty and habit above their own desires and needs. James could feel the frustration building in him. It was hard for him to accept that his marriage was not as perfect as he had always imagined it to be. He suddenly realized that their life had become devoid of depth and sincerity, that they had long lost their true intimacy. And although it hurt him to see that his wife, his partner, was looking for answers in another person, he realized that it was inevitable. The long silence between them and the feigned harmony created the space that Dorothy filled with the illusion of Marcus. This conversation was a moment for both of them to realize that their marriage, no matter how strong it seemed, needed to be reconsidered. They could no longer return to their old lives, to what they had been before. The world they had been building for years had become an empty form for them, devoid of content. Dorothy and James finally realized that staying together out of habit or out of fear of loneliness was a mistake. Their marriage needed a new foundation based on honesty and openness, which had not been there before. After a long conversation, Dorothy left the room feeling strangely relieved. Her confession, although it hurt them both, was the first step towards freeing themselves from an internal rift. She realized that she could no longer live for others without understanding her own needs. She needed to sort herself out to figure out what she wanted, and this process was just beginning. She had a difficult path ahead of her, full of self-discovery and reassessment of everything she considered important. As for James, he was left alone in the room, feeling the weight of his thoughts. There was still anger in him, but with it came the realization that they were both trapped in their own expectations and desires. For the first time in many years, he felt that he too needed to rethink his life, to understand what he really wanted. After a conversation with James, which left a deep mark on their relationship, Dorothy was left alone with herself, as if she found herself in front of a mirror that reflected all her contradictions, fears and desires. She often reflected on how her life had changed, looking into her own emotions and feelings, which were now impossible to hide. Her usual life turned into a strange cocoon, quiet, viscous and empty, and she realized that she would not be able to simply return to the past. Autumn was already in full swing, and this time of year seemed to reflect her condition. The streets were grey and gloomy, and Dorothy noticed that everything in her life, like this city, was gradually shrouded in grey. The meetings with Marcus, which at first were a breath of fresh air, began with the fact that it seemed to her that through him she would regain her lost self. However, the longer she thought about him, the more clearly she realized that perhaps her feelings for Marcus were only a reflection of her desire to regain her youth, freedom and sense of self. This realization began to grow in her soul, gradually awakening the bitter truth. Initially, meetings with Marcus had brought her awe and energy, but now, looking back, she realized that these emotions were nothing more than an illusion. They reminded her of the past, of the life she would have chosen if she hadn't chosen James. Marcus became for her a symbol of what she left behind in her youth: bright dreams, passion for life, freedom to be herself. He symbolized exactly the side of her soul that she thought had disappeared into the daily routine of marriage. She wrapped her feelings for Marcus in romance, forgetting that he was just a human being, part of her past, not her present. Dorothy now felt that her attraction Marcus was only a temporary illusion. Behind their brief meetings, there was not so much a desire to start something new, as a memory of the past, of what she considered lost. Every meeting was a reminder to her, not that she loved Marcus, but that she had lost herself in the role of wife, mother, hostess. This image, which she had painted for herself, prevented her from soberly assessing her feelings. Her affection for Marcus was more a longing for a time when she felt free, rather than a real passion. He became a kind of escape for her, an outlet, not true love. As this realization strengthened, it became obvious to Dorothy that her disappointment was not caused by James or their marriage. At first she blamed others and circumstances, but now she realized that her longing is the result of her own dissatisfaction with herself. She remembered how years ago, when she married James, she abandoned her dreams and ambitions for stability, for peace of mind, for the sake of family. After becoming a wife and mother, she chose a path that seemed to lead to a predictable life, but this predictability eventually became a cage for her. She preferred convenience and habits, but she did not notice how with this decision she gave up what was important to her. Now, realizing that her feelings for Marcus were just a manifestation of her dissatisfaction, she felt pain and shame. It seemed to her that she had betrayed James by turning her eyes to the past, as if that past could bring something back to her. But the most important thing she realized was that she had betrayed herself, her personality, her dreams and desires. She saw that her longing for Marcus was not love, but escape. Her desire to be with him was nothing more than an attempt to fill the void that had formed in her soul from a lack of personal expression. This realization, although painful, was an important step for her. She realized that her life with James, despite the routine and lack of previous passion, was important and meaningful to her. Now that she looked at their relationship soberly, she realized that their marriage was not a mistake, but a choice she made for the sake of family and stability. James was her partner, her friend, the man with whom she had gone through many trials. Their relationship may not have been perfect, but it represented more than just a marriage. It was a symbol of the resilience and strength she values. Yes, there was no passion in their marriage, as with Marcus, but there was dedication and sincerity that became its foundation. As she realized the true nature of her feelings, Dorothy began to feel better. Her anguish gradually receded, giving way to the realization that her life and her choices were not just a series of mistakes. She saw that her affection for Marcus was an illusion, a way to get away from the pain she was experiencing. But now that she has accepted this truth, it has become easier for her to understand that her true happiness and peace should come not from external circumstances, but from within, from her own soul. With this realization, she began to return to her daily activities, but now her attitude towards them has changed. She began to feel a new inner peace, a new determination to be honest with herself and with James. Dorothy realized that she needed to find a way to rebuild her relationship, not just to return to her old life, but to create something new that would give them both the opportunity to be sincere with each other. She realized that their relationship required not preservation for the sake of habit, but reassessment, a new foundation based on trust and honesty. Now her house no longer seemed like a prison to her, as it used to be. Instead, it became a place where she could start all over again, where she could find herself anew. Her life with James was not a mistake, but a part of her journey, a lesson that helped her understand herself more deeply. She realized that every choice she made was important, every moment she spent with him made sense. She realized that her life does not need other people's illusions and does not require external romance. She needed to find peace and satisfaction within herself, to learn to accept and love herself as she had become over the years. She felt stronger now, knowing that she could get through this crisis. There was no longer that excruciating pain in her soul that had forced her to seek salvation in the past. Instead, she gained an understanding that true freedom and happiness cannot be found in the outside world or in a relationship with another person. True freedom comes from inner peace, from being honest with oneself and being willing to be who she really is. When Dorothy returned home that evening, she looked at everything with different eyes. The rooms where she had once felt like a stranger now seemed to be filled with meaning. Everything she and James had created had a deeper meaning for her now. She no longer saw emptiness in these things. On the contrary, she saw in them traces of her life, her history. And although she knew that a difficult path lay ahead of her, she was ready for it. Dorothy couldn't sleep that night. After the flash of awareness that had overtaken her a few days ago, her thoughts kept returning to the essence of her relationship with James, their life together, their marriage. She realized that the path she was trying to choose was impossible without fundamental changes, without an honest look at herself and what they had both built over the years of living together. Her memories of Marcus, all her previous thoughts, all seemed blurred and meaningless now compared to what she really needed to solve what to do next with her real marriage, her family life, her inner needs that have been suppressed for so long. Deep down, she already knew the answer, knew that her marriage to James had reached the point where his continued existence would become meaningless unless they found a way to change their relationship. Their habitual, but long since superficial, life could no longer continue as it was. She felt that neither she nor James would be happy if they remained attached to each other just for the sake of memories and habit. But it was incredibly difficult to decide to break up, to sever the ties that they had been building for years. The next morning, feeling unaccustomed confidence in her decision, Dorothy invited James to a frank conversation. She could no longer remain silent and hide her real feelings from him. It was hard for her, but she realized that honesty is the only way out of this crisis, even if her words hurt. She knew that for the sake of both of them, she had to say everything that she had been hiding for so long. She began to speak slowly and carefully, trying not to hurt his feelings, but also not to conceal anything. When she finally said everything that had accumulated in her soul, the heaviness that had been weighing on her for the last few months seemed to disappear. She felt that it was only from that moment that she became honest with James, that this conversation was a real liberation for her. She told him that she felt lost in this marriage, that the role of wife and mother had overshadowed her own personality, and she now realized that she could no longer live in the shadow of her responsibilities. Dorothy admitted that her search for happiness led her to realize that they both needed something that they could not find in each other. James listened to her words with pain and a heavy heart. It seemed to him that the whole world was collapsing around him. He understood that their marriage was not perfect, that their relationship had become distant over time, but it was hard for him to accept that their union could come to an end. He took this conversation as a blow, but at the same time he began to realize that he himself had been suppressing his true feelings all this time, that he had long lacked sincerity and depth in their relationship. At that moment he realized that their marriage had become an empty formality, and for him, as for Dorothy, it was a revelation. After long hours of conversation, they both realized that they could no longer live in this indecision and tension. They had to choose either start over, which seemed almost impossible, or break up and give each other a chance at a new life. The decision was painful, but inevitable. They had to break this union in order to gain freedom and find themselves. Both understood that their life together would not bring them any more joy, that their connection had become an obstacle for both of them on the way to real happiness. Over the following days, their home began to transform, as if they were gradually letting each other go. Dorothy felt as if the walls, which had previously seemed to her a place of comfort and tranquility, were now just a space full of memories. Every detail reminded her of what she shared with James, of the years when she believed in their union. Now this place seemed painful and frightening to her. She began to pack her things, preparing to leave the house she had spent so many years in. It seemed to her that only by leaving everything behind, she would be able to find a new meaning, a new direction. James, in turn, realized that he needed to let go of the past in order to find his own way. It was hard for him to accept that their marriage was nothing more than a chapter that ended before he was ready. But he realized that keeping Dorothy by his side meant not allowing them both to move forward. He began to prepare for life without her, realizing that their breakup could be an opportunity for him to find himself. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to think about what he really wants from life, and not about what he should do. The process of their separation was full of pain, but also relief. Dorothy felt that she was leaving not just a home and memories, but a part of herself, a part of her life that was important to her, but which could no longer be a part of her. She understood that their breakup was not the end, but a new stage for her and for James. She felt that she was being freed from the burden that had weighed on her for many years, and now she could start a life in which she would be her real self, without having to follow other people's expectations. For James, this breakup was also an opportunity to rethink his life and his values. He realized that his happiness no longer depended on Dorothy, that he could now find the peace he had been missing. Their life together had been an important part of his journey, but now he had to find himself without her participation. He felt that for the first time in many years he could focus on what he wanted, and not on what should have been. The breakup became a lesson for both of them, teaching them that happiness and harmony do not always consist in union, that sometimes parting is the only way to gain freedom and give each other a chance at a new life. Dorothy and James realized that their marriage was not a mistake, but an important part of their life path that helped them both become who they became. They left each other not with guilt or regret, but with respect and gratitude for all the years they spent together. When they finally said goodbye, Dorothy felt a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She understood that now she was facing a difficult path of self-discovery, the path to a new life where she could be herself, without having to meet someone's expectations. She set off towards the future, knowing that she was no longer tied to the past, that now her life belonged only to her. She felt that her heart, though filled with pain, was ready for change and freedom. For James, this farewell was the beginning of a new chapter. He understood that their marriage had not been in vain, that it had given him a lot, but now he had to find his way in life. He began to look at the world with different eyes, realizing that now his happiness depends only on him. After parting with James, Dorothy was left alone in their former family home, which now seemed to her more like a shadow of the past than a cozy corner. The rooms, once filled with shared memories, familiar family sounds and worries, were now empty and alien. Every detail of the interior that she chose herself, every photo on the wall that used to cause her warmth and peace, now reminded her of the lost past, of those years when she was part of a whole, seemingly unshakable world. Now this house was alien to her, and every corner of it reminded her of the life she had left. It was unbearable to stay in this house. Dorothy felt that if she stayed here, Her attempts to find a new self would be futile. Every day would be just a shadow of the past. The power of memories proved to be too much of a burden for her, and she realized that if she wanted to live in the present, she would have to leave everything that reminded her of her past life. This decision was not easy for her. Her soul was torn apart between the fear of a new life and the desire to finally find her own way. In the end, she decided to leave the house. Dorothy packed her things, leaving behind everything that made up her family life. She knew that only by parting with this house, which was a symbol of her former life, would she be able to truly move forward. After collecting her few personal belongings, Dorothy left the place forever, which until recently had been the epitome of stability and comfort for her. Her path led her to a small coastal town, which she had long dreamed of. Even in her youth, before marriage, she imagined life in a quiet, cozy place by the sea, but years of family life, caring for children and responsibilities, pushed her dreams into the background. Now that she was alone and free, she decided that this city would be her new home. Dorothy rented a small apartment overlooking the sea and began to settle into this new world for her, feeling how every day her life begins to fill with a different rhythm. At first, loneliness was not easy for her. Dorothy was used to the noise of her family, to constant employment, to a life where she did not belong to herself. Now she was surrounded by silence, broken only by the sound of waves outside the window and the cries of seagulls. These first weeks were a real challenge for her, but also a time of awareness. She began to notice that she no longer needed to adjust to someone's schedule. No need to get up early to cook breakfast. No need to fill her time with the usual worries. Gradually, step by step, Dorothy learned to appreciate this silence. She began to go out for long walks along the shore, thinking about her life, about the past and the future, about who she wants to become. The sea air seemed to purify her thoughts, to free her from everything superfluous. She began to enjoy this solitude, finding in it the peace that she missed so much. Her every day was now filled with simple but valuable moments: morning jogging, reading books she hadn't had time for before, and watching sunsets. What she had been looking for so long appeared in her soul: peace. Over time, Dorothy began to find inner harmony. One day, remembering her marriage and the path that brought her here, she realized that she no longer holds grudges against herself and James. Their breakup was a necessary step. It became the door to a new life for her. Now her heart was no longer tormented by regrets about the past. She began to look forward, learning to live for herself. Dorothy stopped feeling that she had destroyed or lost something. On the contrary, she realized that their breakup had allowed her to discover a new world in herself, the existence of which she had not suspected. Gradually, her life began to take on a new meaning. She remembered her long-held dream of painting and enrolled in painting courses, which took place in a small art studio on the embankment. Inspired by the nature and silence of the coastal city, she began to paint landscapes, sea views, and people she met on the streets. Her paintings became for her a peculiar expression of her inner state. Through painting, she searched and found in herself those feelings and emotions that were hidden under a layer of former duties. Every brush stroke, every painting filled her life with meaning and joy. Dorothy began to make friends among the locals, people who also moved here in search of peace and a new life. Many of them were just like her, people who were tired of the hustle and bustle of the city and the pressure of society's expectations. They were different, but they were united by one thing: the desire for simplicity and harmony. Dorothy began to feel like part of a new community where she was accepted for who she was, without expectations or demands. Communicating with these people gave her the feeling that she was not alone, that her search was not an accident, but part of a common path that many people went through. Every day, Dorothy became more immersed in her new life. Her past with James no longer caused pain or regret. On the contrary, she now saw this past as a valuable experience that helped her become who she was now. She realized that their marriage was an important chapter in her life, but this chapter ended to give rise to a new stage. She began to perceive her memories as lessons that taught her a lot, but which could no longer control her life. She stopped feeling like a part of the past. Now the present has become her world. It took several months before Dorothy felt that she had found inner harmony. She realized that happiness does not depend on external circumstances, on having a family or stability. It is born inside. It was her own discovery, her own personal lesson that she had learned all this time. She realized that happiness does not consist in following other people's expectations or obeying imposed roles, but in the ability to be at peace with oneself, to live in accordance with one's desires and feelings. Now her life was filled with peace and joy. She no longer felt lost or lonely. Her loneliness became a source of strength and inspiration for her. It allowed her to find answers to questions that once seemed unsolvable to her. She learned to listen to herself, trust her feelings, and not be afraid to be alone. Dorothy no longer sought the approval of others. She gained self-confidence and began to live based only on her own principles. A year after moving in, she realized that she had found what she had been looking for so long. Her life has become simple and meaningful. She learned to appreciate the moments that had previously eluded her. She found inner harmony and happiness that did not depend on external circumstances. She no longer felt like she needed to be someone for someone. Now she was just herself, and that was enough. The past with James, their long and complicated marriage, all this remained in her heart as an important stage in her life, but now it was no longer her present. She had freed herself from the burden that had been weighing on her all these years, and now her path was free, open to new opportunities.